his first big hit single, a #1 single, takes him into markets that he hadn't previously been in. He'd clearly wanted a hit single, and of course, once he got a #1 single, he recoiled in horror from the experience. I mean, it's classic Neil Young.
Keep me searching for a heart of gold.
Young chose to follow his most successful album with a more aggressive set of songs. After failed sessions at the ranch, the decision was made to record the new material live during a substantial tour.
The Time Fades Away album and the Time Fades Away tour was a very troubled period in Neil Young's life. He hates that tour. The album has never come out on CD to this day. Even when he recently released a bunch of them, it was conspicuously missing. It's almost like he can't stomach going back to it. And not without good reason, it must be said. Even before the tour began, you had Danny Whitten's death. Danny Whitten OD'd while they were preparing to go out on tour. Danny Whitten was supposed to be part of Time Fades Away, but he didn't make it. The reason he didn't make it was that he basically couldn't play, and Neil Young had to get rid of him and give him the money to go back home on the plane. And of course, he famously OD'd after that, and that totally freaked Neil Young out. And it was at the start of the tour. It went on for far too long, and it was not a happy time for Neil Young. Having said all that, what do you get from the record that comes out? Something unique. I think possibly only from the time Jackson Browne's Run on Empty would be the only other one that I could think of, where you've got a live album consisting of entirely new tracks.
When I was a young boy, my mama said to me, your dad is leaving home today.
The track Don't Be Denied is an example of an autobiographical look at Neil's life, where he's looking back at his childhood, at his time in Buffalo Springfield, and how he, as he says in the chorus, he was not going to be denied as he moved forward throughout his life, despite some challenges that rose up. And I think on that record is an example of how, again, even though personally he was experiencing some tragedy in his personal life, he was not going to let those tragedies stop him from progressing musically or professionally as an artist and as a musician.
On its release, the album was largely dismissed by critics and audiences expecting a return to Harvest territory.
When that record came out, I think it confused a lot of people. One of the greatest headlines, I think it was Nick Kent's review, but it was that wonderful headline, Neil Young Fades Away. And it was almost put a stamp on him there, it's over, the game's up. He did his harvest, he hit a peak, and now he's going down fast. And if you listen to the songs on that album, they're bleak. You know, the Time Fades Away, the title track, kicks off the whole thing, and you know, it's full of junkies and street people, and it's just a downer, but it's a great song, and that album's got some really strong tracks in it.
I mean, he's never really offered an explanation as to why Time Fades Away has not come out on CD. Maybe it's just too dark for him. Maybe it's just too redolent of painful times and memories for him.
Continuing in the more sombre and angry vein of Time Fades Away, Young began work on new material, recording the tracks live at a Los Angeles rehearsal space. Despite touring this material in the US, Canada and the UK, the album remained unreleased until 1975. Instead, in early 1974, Young returned to the studio and produced one of the most acclaimed albums of his career, On the Beach.
Some people been talking me down.
On the Beach, I find, is a very dark album. I think it came from a dark period in Neil's life. It emerged from a time when there was a lot of drug use around him, and friends were dying from the drug use. He was in a relationship that he was trying to get out of at the time. Things were kind of foundering with Carrie Snodgrass. And so he was spending a lot more time away from the ranch and more time in the LA music scene and getting on all the bad habits that emerged from that. It's a dark album, it's a heavy album, and it's not heavy in terms of its music, it's heavy in terms of its lyric content that's there. It's a rough diamond in the sense that it again represents that whole notion of get everybody in the studio and let's just catch the moment, because there are certainly mistakes, it's not perfect. But it's an album for a lot of Neil Young fans that they point to and say that's their favorite, that album, and it must speak to them certainly in some way. I'm not a big fan of that album. I just find it too dark, too oppressive in terms of some of the themes that are there. And I think Neil kind of is a little bit directionless on that album as well.
All the sailors with their seasick mamas hear the sirens on the shore, singing songs for pence with tailors who charge $10 at the door.
On the Beach, he strips himself bare. Some people might find that difficult to listen to. I find it quite gripping and compelling. I mean, it sucks you in. You know, I think there's some of his strongest songwriting, particularly on that second side.
I don't think On the Beach is as dark an album as something like Tonight's the Night, which confronts death directly. I've always regarded as On the Beach as being an incredibly therapeutic album. It actually starts off with Walk On, which is a very positive song, and the whole album is about resolving conflict. Ambulance Blues includes the line, I guess I'll call it Sickness Gone. This is a song about self-therapy to a certain extent. It's Neil Young writing himself out of a very negative phase, which I think he does, and I've often always found that to be an incredibly uplifting album. It's got its dark moments, obviously, but it's Neil Young coming to terms with it. Critically, well, it's a rediscovered album, and I think it keeps getting better over and over as the years have passed. The Neil Young fanzine, Broken Arrow, even, I think 2 years ago, they took a poll and it came out as Neil Young's best album there, even. And that means it's better than Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere, or After the Gold Rush, or Harvest, or Reggae Glory, or all the rest of them. It's quite an achievement. Even Tonight's the Night, I mean, they voted it better than that. So, you know, I take great sort of satisfaction in that album has survived the test of time, but I always felt it would from the first time I heard it. I thought it was just an unbelievable record.
I think it's, with the exception maybe of Trans, the strangest record he ever made. On the Beach, to me, seems like, I mean, isn't there an image in which he's masturbating in front of the fireplace? It seems to me like an album recorded while masturbating in front of the fireplace. And you would think that would be terrible. Doesn't sound like a good, I wouldn't say that was a good way to make a record. It's a very good record made while masturbating in front of the fireplace. And if you can imagine that, then you'll like it.
In June 1975, the album written during the alcohol-drenched days of 1973 was finally released. Audiences bemused by the Tonight's the Night shows in the US and UK at the time were now offered the companion piece, a funereal album which mourned the passing of Danny Whitten and roadie Bruce Berry, while capturing the essence of mid-70s Los Angeles excess.
Because it does take you on a journey. It does have a theme to it. And certainly Neil Young may not have envisioned it as being a concept album. It is a concept album. It does have a focus to it that some of his other albums didn't have. But again, I think there's also some strong songwriter on that too, and a strong statement being made. The other side of it, of that album too, in terms of its appeal, is the fact that Neil really didn't give a damn about his career at that point. That he would go in and record an album that any other artist would have certainly shelved or started over or taken out all the imperfections. It's an album just chock full of imperfections that he was willing to put out, probably against the dictates of his record label even, because he felt that it was a strong statement, but also it's a statement as to who he was at that time. He went through a very dark period then too. I mean, he was drinking to excess. His stage shows, doing Tonight's the Night 3 times, you know, in a live performance, represented, you know, again, his kind of like a lost weekend, but also a bit of a loss of direction, a bit of feeling adrift from what was happening in the music scene at that time. And also the frustration too, when everyone wants him to do another Harvest, do a Harvest 2. You know, and he did record, you know, songs that would have made another Harvest type album, but then shelved them, preferring instead to release Tonight's the Night, because that was more of a statement of who he was at that point.
Tonight's the Night exists in an idealized form somewhere. I don't know where, but it really is another Smile in that sense. I mean, I saw the first ever performance of Tonight's the Night outside the Roxy, where they, you know, which was the first date of the Tonight's the Night tour in England, which was in Manchester. And I had no points of reference because I didn't really know his work that well. It just happened to be somebody I went to see. And I couldn't understand why everyone was so upset, because I didn't know he wasn't playing any old material, because I didn't really know his material anyway. You know, I thought it was very powerful, but I didn't really understand why people were freaking out. There clearly is, within the Tonight's the Night experience, some quintessential masterpiece. The album falls short of it slightly. In isolation, you would still say it's a great work, but it isn't quite what it could have been. And because it has this kind of after-the-fact ambience to it, you feel that he kind of fell short.
My recollection at the time is nobody understood the record, really. But I think by this stage, the public had grown accustomed to Neil Young's ways, and the only thing to expect from Neil Young was the unexpected. And it, you know, I mean, it came on the back of this weird soundtrack, Journey Through the Past, this weird live album, Time Fades Away, On the Beach, which is a great album but hadn't necessarily been recognised as such at the time, and then Tonight's the Night. I mean, I think the public perception of Neil Young at this time, I mean, you know, think of all those 14-year-old girls who only 4 years earlier had bought Harvest, or 3 years earlier had bought Harvest because they loved Heart of Gold. You know, I mean, what must they have thought? They'd be 17 by this time, I guess, but they still must have been perplexed by something as dark and raw as Tonight's the Night. But in terms of his career, I mean, in the long term, it just enhanced the mystique and the legend. I'm not sure that's how Warner Reprise saw it at the time.
Having abandoned plans for another country album entitled Homegrown, Young and the Crazy Horse Ensemble moved to Malibu and began recording sessions at David Briggs's home within the same area. Released only months after Tonight's the Night, Zuma saw Young return with a less combative and difficult sound.
Zuma is the album that marks his transition out of this very dark phase. There's a lighter tone and a feel of not so much optimism, but a sort of resigned tone of experience and of having come through something and survived. I think that's what you hear on Zuma.